Climate change, food security, and human mobility. My name is Sandeep Athala. I'm a senior program associate with the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Our program is 19 years old, and we look at the various connections between health, environment, livelihoods, population, and security. Today's event is brought to you as part of our HELPS project, which incidentally stands for the words I just said: health, environment, livelihoods, population, and security. HELPS is a 5-year effort generously funded by USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health. As many of you, I'm sure, know, the Woodrow Wilson Center is a formal memorial to our 28th president, the only president thus far to have achieved a PhD. And in his honor, we aim to bring the worlds of policy, practice, and academia together to gain a better understanding. You have bios in front of you, so I want to direct your attention now to our moderator and 3 speakers. Kathleen Mogelgaard is our moderator. She's an independent consultant working with the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center. We will then hear from Kevin Henry, who's the project coordinator for Where the Rain Falls initiative with CARE. And we do know that it is falling quite heavily in DC today. And thank you for joining us in that downpour. We'll then hear from Stephanie Hansen, who's the Director of Policy and Outreach at the 1 Acre Fund. And Susan Bradley will conclude today's event. She's the Division Director for the Bureau for Food Security at Feed the Future. A quick note about today's meeting: we are being webcasted live, so what that means for you here in the room is that when we do come to the discussion, I'd ask that you use a mic, and please introduce yourself and affiliation. My colleagues will be coming around with the mics. So I will turn it over to Kathleen now then. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Sandeep, and thank you to all of you for coming here to participate in this very timely discussion that we're having today. My name is Kathleen Mogelgaard, and as Sandeep mentioned, I'm a consultant for the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's a privilege to be moderating today's discussion on the farmer's dilemma, climate change, food security, and human mobility. In just a moment, I'm going to turn the program over to our outstanding panel of speakers to share their expertise. But first, I wanted to set the stage by sharing an anecdote from my own experience that I've had recently with this topic. Just last week, I returned from Senegal, where I traveled on behalf of Oxfam America to learn more about how climate change adaptation is being integrated into Feed the Future, the U.S. government's Global Hunger and Food Security Initiative. About 70% of Senegal's 13 million people are employed in the agriculture sector, and much of that is smallholder, rain-fed agriculture. The sector is already struggling with extremely variable rainfall, a pattern that is likely to be exacerbated by climate change. Undernutrition is moderate in Senegal, but persistent, and about 16% of children under 5 suffer from stunting. According to demographic projections, Senegal's population is likely to grow from 13 million today to somewhere between 25 and 32 million by 2050. As climate change brings about increasing variability in rainfall, higher temperatures, and more extreme weather events, ensuring food security in Senegal is a growing challenge. While I was there, I had the opportunity to visit Kër Moussa, which is a community about 60 kilometers from Dakar. Historically, Kër Moussa was a community of farmers, but in recent years, declining soil fertility and soil erosion resulting from heavy downpours and high winds has made farming in this community very difficult. Most of the men in Kër Moussa have moved to Dakar to try to earn an income, and the women who are left behind are doing what they can to address soil erosion so that they can grow enough food to feed their families. With a small amount of financial support to buy buckets, wheelbarrows, and work gloves, women in this community are building small dikes and other barriers to slow down water flow during flooding events, helping to retain soil and recharge local groundwater. And you can see in this photo that this is a number of women from Karamusa who are carrying rocks in buckets on their heads and then constructing these kinds of very simple barriers or dikes to slow down water flow during the flooding events that happen in the community. You can see here a number of the barriers that they've built, and also in the background you can see they're planting windbreaks, vegetative windbreaks, and that's an early stage windbreak there to slow down the high winds that are also contributing to soil erosion in the community. The woman on the right in this photo pulled together about a dozen other women in her community and spent 3 days digging the pit that you see in the photo on the left. It's placed strategically so that during times of flooding, water flow comes down the slight incline there, flows through the rock barrier, catches the soil that is eroding, and then the water flows into the pit where women use it for household drinking water purposes as well as for watering their vegetable gardens. That also serves the purpose of recharging the local groundwater supplies by keeping that water in place. In this particular case in Karamusa, we can see several adaptive responses to the climate variability that has affected food security in the community. The men have moved to Dakar to try to earn an income, and the women have stayed in place and adopted what many see as simple and appropriate technologies to better cope with the climate changes they're experiencing. This is a story that is playing out in different ways all across Africa and around the world. And we'll be exploring these issues in our discussion today. We'll be asking questions about how climate change is affecting smallholder farmers and the many factors that come into play for them as they assess options for achieving food security in the context of climate change. We will also investigate questions related to how programs and policies can best support and encourage adaptive responses that will help smallholder farmers and their families thrive over the long term in the context of climate change. For our program today, we'll hear short presentations from each of our speakers, then reserve a good chunk of time for discussion with all of you. And I really do hope that we will have a good chunk of time for that discussion to hear from you and your experiences and your thoughts on these issues. Sandeep has already introduced our speakers. We'll start with Kevin Henry, who will share with us the highlights of Where the Rain Falls research, an 8-country action research initiative on climate variability, food security, and human migration undertaken by CARE and the UN University. We're really looking forward to hearing the highlights of that research in Kevin's presentation today. Then we'll hear from Stephanie Hansen, who is the Director of Policy and Outreach at the One Acre Fund, an organization that's doing innovative work with smallholder farmers, most of them women, in East Africa. And we're looking forward to hearing from Stephanie about the model that's employed by the One Acre Fund and how they're carrying out that work in the context of climate change. And finally, we'll hear from Susan Bradley, who's had a long career at USAID in food assistance and food security, with a focus on reducing risk and building resilience in female-headed households. We are really looking forward to having this discussion today. And once again, I thank all of you for joining us. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our panelists, starting with Kevin. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kathleen, for that introduction, which I think certainly also your experiences in Senegal, I think you will see a lot of parallels with what we found in our research. And thanks also to the Wilson Center for hosting this event. We appreciate that very much. So, I'd like to, as Kathleen already mentioned, I'd just start by saying that Where the Rain Falls is a research project, but it's also a research project where CARE is committed to taking the findings of that research and bringing it into policy, but also translating it into practice in our work at the community level in climate change adaptation. And we did this work in partnership with the United United Nations University, as far as a research partner. And then also we did it with funding from two donors, the MacArthur Foundation here in the U.S. and the AXA Group, which is a large French-based insurance company. So interesting, mix of donors and partners. I think, before kind of talking about the objectives, of the research and our findings, just to frame it, why is CARE, doing this kind of work? What are our concerns? What are our issues? And I think it comes down to the fact that we live in a world already where there are 7 billion people. And I'm using round numbers, so forgive me, roughly 1 billion who are food insecure, roughly 1 billion who are obese. By 2050, we'll have 9 billion people, of which roughly 2 billion will actually be over the age of 65. And we live in a warming world, according to the latest projections. If we don't do something serious about emissions, we're talking about a 4 to 6 degrees centigrade temperature increase by the end of this century. So if we're already struggling to provide food security for all in today's world, what is that going to look like 10, 50 or more years down the road? And for CARE, that's what motivates us. And it's not just research for research's sake, although we hope we're contributing to the knowledge base, but it's really then applying that to our work and hopefully sharing that with policymakers at various levels. So with that, I will talk just very briefly about, objectives of the study and maybe focus even more, go on to really look at the research questions, because as Kathleen said in the introduction, we're really looking at impacts of climate change, and particularly changes in rainfall patterns and how those affect food security, which in our rural areas means largely how do they affect smallholder agriculture, crop and livestock production, and food availability in those markets. And then how those impacts in turn influence household migration decisions. So it's complex, and we try to avoid the simplistic, talk about environmental refugees and climate refugees and all of that, but clearly there are impacts, and our goal was to try to really tease that out, all of the complexities. And so our main focus, and what I'll spend most of the time today talking about, is really the first question, which is under what circumstances do households use migration as a risk management strategy to deal with rainfall variability and food insecurity? I will touch very briefly on the second question, because obviously people are concerned, okay, well, that's what's going on now. What can we expect, 30, 40, 50 years, down the road, and how will this play out? So I'll come back to that very briefly. I'll just also, in terms of giving you the broad picture, we did this research in 8 countries, and 8 very diverse countries, so ranging from highland sites in Peru and Guatemala, to Ghana and Tanzania and sub-Saharan Africa, and 4 countries in Asia, again, very diverse sites from the Mekong Delta of Vietnam to the highlands of northern Thailand, and also rural sites in both India and Bangladesh. So very diverse countries. And I won't talk too much about this, but as we kind of finished the field research and we're trying to make sense of all of this, we also saw that, well, different of these countries fit into different profiles in terms of their macro socioeconomic kind of characteristics, and that helps us then also answer the question, because under what circumstances do households use migration depends on a number of factors, some of them at that macro, social, and economic level, but then also, importantly, the specific sites where we did our field research were rural communities in these 8 countries, and very diverse sites, some with quite significant levels of annual rainfall, over 1,700 millimeters a year at the highest, down to semi-arid sites with less than 600 millimeters of rainfall. So very diverse. We had highland, we had sites virtually at sea level, we had sites near urban centers, we had remote rural sites. So, and all of those things have an impact in terms of how households, what options are available to households and which options they use. We used mixed methods approach to our research. We had household surveys, and we completed over 1,300 household surveys in the 8 countries. We had over 2,000 participants in focus group discussions and expert interviews. And in addition to those methods, we also collected local meteorological data. For instance, in the case of Tanzania, we had 60 years of annual rainfall data for the site in the district where we did our research. And so we were able to compare perceptions of change with what the actual data said. So, very interesting, but obviously, complex sort of puzzle to put together with a lot of information that was gathered. And I think if you're interested in more, we have hard copies of the global policy report sitting out there, and all of our reports are online, both the synthesis report and 7 country case studies. So just very high level on findings. I'll just say, we had 3 variables basically. So we were looking at rainfall, what was happening, what did people perceive as happening, and the short answer there is that people do perceive significant changes in rainfall patterns occurring. It's not necessarily so much more rain or so much less, but dramatic changes in the patterns and increased unpredictability in rainfall, which of course for rain-fed agriculture and smallholder farmers has huge implications for their livelihoods. In terms of food security, definitely because these households were largely dependent on rain-fed agriculture, and they were seeing these the variability in rainfall, it was already having impacts on their livelihoods. And let's just say these are people, for the most part, who are already in a tenuous kind of situation from a livelihoods perspective. So for them, climate variability, climate change is another stressor on top of what they already experience, and something of great concern, actually, to the people we talked about in these communities. And then finally, they're using migration already. Migration is nothing new, and it's very complex, the reasons they do it. But, we found that almost all of the migration in our research sites was happening within national boundaries. It was mostly individuals, except in India, where households were migrating as groups. It was 2/3 male, but with a lot of indications of growing female participation in labor migration, so roughly 1/3 on the whole in our country. So, and another very interesting thing, when we think about migration, people automatically think rural to urban migration. And what we found is in a lot of countries it was rural to rural. So they were going from more highly stressed rural environments, with fewer opportunities to, rural areas where they could still use their skills, but where the opportunities were greater. I'm going to skip over largely this very complicated slide, but it's an interesting part of the findings, and it basically says, there are different profiles of households, and if you look, on the far right, the most vulnerable households for whom migration isn't even an option. They can't even literally afford or physically or economically unable to migrate and are really trapped. To on the other side, those for whom migration is actually a positive tool that they're able to use to enhance and diversify their families' sources of income and future economic prospects. So there's a lot more there, but I won't go into great depth. This next slide is actually one that I presented last week in Dhaka at the Community-Based Adaptation 7 conference as part of a panel with Mary Robinson, focused on the human rights and equity implications of climate change and climate change adaptation. And I won't go through all of this, but maybe touch on a couple of the points that are particularly important from a care perspective, because our research definitely surfaced very significant rights and equity issues. And, you know, just to use one example, in Bangladesh, you know, our research there showed huge gender implications for the migration that was taking place from the communities where we did our research. So in that site, 97% of the migrants were male. So remember, on average in the other sites, it was roughly 2/3 male, 1/3 female. So here it was almost exclusively male, mostly heads of household, who were then leaving behind their wives and children, resulting obviously in significant increased workload for their wives, you know, who were expected to continue to farm the land and, you know, continue with economic activities in addition to all of their other tasks. But, you know, interestingly, we also found that this migration was exposing women who were left behind to a significant increase in the incidence of sexual harassment and other sort of even sexual violence in some cases. So, you know, very, very clear and very stark gender implications, and you know, just the gender inequality, you know, came through very strongly in that Bangladesh research. Another thing that I'll just touch on briefly and won't go into, but access to and control over land and water resources is critical. If we're talking about rural communities, smallholder agriculture, adaptation to climate change, understanding, you know, land ownership, control and access to land and water resources is critical. And clearly our research showed that landless and land scarce households were most vulnerable and most often basically forced to use migration as a risk management strategy simply because they had fewer opportunities to diversify their economic activities where they were. And we used the Vietnam case as an example where the combined percentage of landless and land scarce households was 57%. So it's a very significant issue. And it's actually a growing issue there because land is increasingly being acquired by larger farmers from smaller farmers, and the larger farmers are mechanizing their operations, further displacing agricultural labor. So we see, you know, basically the beginnings of what's probably going to be a long-term trend in areas like the Mekong Delta. So I won't go talk about the other issues I've highlighted here, including right to education and governance issues, but from a care perspective, these are all really important issues and ones that have to be on our radar screen and have to be a part of how we try to address climate change and adaptation to climate change. So I think at this point I'm going to rest my voice and give you a break from listening to me, and we'll just show a short video that is drawn from our Tanzania research site, so you can just get a little bit of a flavor of the communities there where we did the research and hear the voices of some of the participants in our research.
Hali ya hewa ya siku hizi, masika ni kama vuli. Zamani kulikuwa na mvua mwezi huu ambayo haifai hata utoke nje. Lakini kwa siku hizi, hapana. Ni jua tu.
For decades, along the flanks of Kilimanjaro, families have flowed from the Vudey Highlands and Bangalala Midlands to the Ruvu-Mferejini River Valley as one way to cope in times of drought and hunger. As in any family, the decision to move is rarely an easy one.
Watu walikuwa wanagombana maana maji haitoshi, alafu chakula hamna, maana jua lilikuwa kali, alafu maji yalikuwa hayatoshi. ndio wakaamua kuhama. Sisi tukawa tunabaki kwa ajili ya familia ile inayosoma. Hilo ndio tatizo la kule. Wanalima wanavuna, lakini nao maendeleo ya shule hamna. Na sisi huku kilichotubakisha huku ni kwa ajili ya shule.
Aminieli John Msuya lives in the highlands of Woodey. Her husband moved to the Ruvu-Miferejini Valley to farm and bring their family food, until he became ill.
Ameugua sasa hapa akafariki. Lakini tangu afariki hali ya hewa ya siku hizi, masika ni kama vuli.
Maji yalikuwa haya. Kisha huku ni kwa ajili ya
ameugua sasa hapa akafariki. Lakini tangu afariki mimi nalima mwenyewe na watoto wangu. Huyu ni mjukuu wa watoto wa kike. Mama yake huyu yuko Dar es Salaam. Nakaa na mjukuu ili nimpate wa kunichotea maji.
Many families who moved to the river valley were able to avoid hunger and build better lives. But now, living in Ruvu-Miferejini has its own risks, with more frequent droughts, irregular irrigation from dams, and unpredictable rainfall patterns.
Mimi nikitoka mlimani nilifuata maji kwenye ile bonde la Ruvu, na tayari haya maji nao tena yametoroka, yameshakauka, yamekuwa madogo, na huyu tayari ameshaanza kusogea tena pale nilipokuwa nimetegemea amepakimbia tena, anaanza kusogea mbele tena.
Mimea haikui na dumaa, unakuta mmea unakuwa kufika kiwango cha juu kidogo, unadhoofika, unafia hapo kwa hauendelei tena. Maji yamekuwa madogo sasa hivi hayafiki. Sasa hivi sijalilima kabisa lipo. Tulilima sehemu ikakataa kuingia, mahindi yakafa, basi nikaacha kwanza.
Poor people who rely on rainfall for farming are at great risk for hunger, as they often have few choices for their families. Sometimes even migration is not an option. Many people are in essence trapped in a cycle of poverty.
Unajua sio kwamba sisi tumefanana. Kuna wengine wako juu kidogo ndio wanaotufaa. Tunaenda wanatutafuta, tunaenda kwa hata kama ni kufagia mazizi tunafagia, tunapewa, tunapata kula, tunaishi. Mvua ikishakatika hatuna la kufanya. Tunabaki hivyo hivyo, Mungu anatusaidia hivyo hivyo jinsi atakavyotusaidia. Tuna mahali wa kwenda si.
And not everyone wants to move. They're connected to their land, their families and friends, and the places they call home. Instead, they want better knowledge, stronger choices, and real solutions. Solutions that build on their skills and strengths, and ensure food security for their families, no matter how or where the rain falls.
Kutoka mimi sitaki. Hapana. Nataka nikae nyumbani kwangu nifanye shughuli zangu. Sasa ukiona hivyo vigibi hapa, kama utahama mwezi huu ukija yamepotea. Haya anataka kupaliliwa kila mwezi kwa sababu kuna maji.
I think maybe that's, why don't we, yeah, because I'm also probably at risk of running over. So let me just kind of pick up on that, and then if we could go back, to the next slide, and I'll just talk a very little bit about our research results in Tanzania, just to give you a little bit deeper flavor. And this map actually is one of a series developed for us by folks at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, and you'll find them in our reports. But this very visual visually shows you, where people are going, from when they migrate from the villages where we did our research, and it gives you other kind of important information. So just from a visual perspective, I think these maps are very helpful. I won't go in depth into the findings of the Tanzania research. One of the things I will say is maybe to highlight this third point, which is really one thing that came out very clearly is, the biggest driver for food insecurity and migration in this area really came down to water scarcity and water stress. And so the three factors most affecting household migration decisions were increased drought frequency, longer drought periods, and water shortage. So, water is clearly very much on the minds of the people in these communities. And then the other thing I'll say about this research, which actually speaks to our second research question, which is the more future-oriented one. In the case of Tanzania, we took the data from the household survey. We developed an agent-based model. And I won't, for those who are interested, I could tell you more about that if you have questions. But basically, it's a way of using data and looking at household decision making, and then projecting forward using a number of different scenarios. So in this case, we used 4 different rainfall scenarios of differing degrees of wetting or drying from the current baseline, and looked out over the next 30 years. And basically what we found is that vulnerable households, there is a significant risk of much greater outmigration by vulnerable households from these villages if, in fact, there is significant drying over the coming decades in this part of Tanzania. So it just shows actually the sensitivity of these households to water scarcity and climate change, and how that may be manifest in increased reliance on migration as a risk management strategy. As I mentioned earlier, we're taking the findings of our research and we're designing community-based climate change adaptation projects in 4 countries, of which Tanzania is one. And what I would say is, if that slide I showed you in terms of some of the major rights and equity issues surfaced by our research, we're very much taking all of those considerations into account in designing our community-based adaptation projects. So all of them in the 4 countries where we're doing that work, Peru, Tanzania, India, and Thailand, we're very much focusing on women's empowerment. We're focusing on access to water resources in particular, which we found to be a challenge, and governance of water so that poor people have better access to what water is available, and then also very much focused on the most marginalized communities. So in the case of India, for instance, we're working with women from Adivasi communities, so the scheduled tribes, in that part of India. So we're really trying to drill down and take the broad learnings, but make sure that the poorest and most vulnerable in these communities actually are benefiting from what we do in climate change adaptation. So I'll skip over kind of the details on what we're doing in that community-based adaptation project in Tanzania, but suffice it to say it's very much focused on water resource and governance and access of the poor to those resources, and we're linking it to another major care initiative where we're working with partners in Tanzania called the Global Water Initiative. So. Finally, I won't say too much just because I'm running out of time on policy implications, but we can talk more about that in questions and answers. But let's just suffice it to say that both at the global level and in each national context, we developed a set of policy reflections based on the findings of our research. And we launched these reports and presented them at COP18 in Doha at the end of last year. So one of our, we had a series of high-level recommendations, obviously focusing on key points related to mitigation and the need actually for much more ambitious efforts to reduce emissions, finance, and particularly the stunning inadequacy of financing for adaptation at the community level in these countries, and then also kind of the growing specter of what's discussed as loss and damage in that context, which is if you don't mitigate and you can't adapt, then you have to start talking about loss and and damage. And again, making sure that the poorest and most vulnerable, let's just say, are included in those processes and any compensation that ultimately results. So, and I think the other critical thing I'll say, and then I will just, I'll end, is really the need to get out of our silos, if you will, and to get beyond thinking of food security over here and climate change here and sustainable development over here, and the need for integrated, holistic approaches at the national level, but also at the global level. So we developed, in addition to kind of our global level recommendations, a series of recommendations at the national and local level. So those include, really the need for comprehensive planning, ensuring that the most vulnerable, are actually very much front and center in the thinking and the planning, and also ensuring full integration of gender considerations. So let me stop there, and thank you. And like I said, all of our reports are available, online. So anyone who is interested, we hope you'll take a look at them, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about them. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. That was a really helpful overview of the research findings. And if those of you here have questions, please note them. I do hope that in the question and answer period, I know that I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about how CARE's community-based adaptation programs have been influenced by the findings of this research. It would be great to dig into that a little bit more. And You've provided some very intriguing initial remarks to help us think about some of the policy implications of this work too. So I hope that those are some questions that we can further explore in the question and answer period. So thank you very much for that. And I think we will move right on now to a presentation from Stephanie, One Acre Fund. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here today to kind of continue where Kevin started us and to drill a little bit deeper into the particular region where One Acre Fund works, which is East Africa. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that One Acre Fund does in the field with smallholder farmers to help them reach household food security, as well as mitigate the effects of climate change. I'll look at two specific mechanisms that we use for addressing climate change, and then I'll share with you the story of one of our clients in Kenya to sort of contextualize the impact firsthand. So first, a little bit about One Acre Fund. We are an agriculture nonprofit started in 2006, and our mission is to help smallholder farmers increase their incomes through increased agriculture productivity. Our target market is the smallholder farmer that Kevin just talked about in his presentation. We focus on farmers who have under 5 acres of land, who primarily grow staple food crops and are not reaching food security currently. The majority of these farmers practice rain-fed agriculture, and the majority of them are women. The One Acre Fund operating model helps these women double their farm income per planted acre through a nonprofit revenue model. So though we are a nonprofit, our clients actually pay for all of the services that they receive from us. We believe this is the only way to develop a financially sustainable model to serve farmers at scale. One Acre Fund currently is serving about 130,000 farmers in 3 countries. We will grow to serve over 160,000 farmers by the end of this year. By 2020, our goal is to serve 1.5 million farmers. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about that client that I referred to. The client is a farmer in one of 3 countries at the moment, Kenya, Rwanda, or Burundi. We will expand to a 4th country later this year, which will most likely be Tanzania, actually. We started a trial in southern Tanzania late last year, and it's very, very promising in the southern highlands. So most of the world's poor are farmers. They share the same profession and the same challenges. To feed a family of 6 on 1 acre of land with very simple hand tools and no irrigation. This is really not working. Most families are not food secure, and 1 in 7 of One Acre Fund's clients, as they're coming into our organization, 1 in 7 of their children die before the age of 5. because farming is the world's most dominant profession for the poor, this presents actually tremendous opportunity. And One Acre Fund believes that actually the combination of very simple tools and education can help these farmers reach household food security and mitigate the effects of climate change as well as adapt to future changes. So how does One Acre Fund do that? I'm going to describe our operating model for you, and I think the two main innovations that we offer as an organization. The first is that we offer a bundled package of services for the small farmer. When you are a rural farmer living very, very far away from infrastructure, it's extremely difficult to access every element of the value chain that you need to increase your productivity. Sustainable intensification is just not realistic for most of these farmers. So, One Acre Fund offers a 4-part operating model that starts with organizing farmers into producer groups. So when we enter a community, we identify the existing self-help groups, and we ask those groups to turn themselves into One Acre Fund groups of 6 to 12 clients. Those groups are then able to access seed and fertilizer on credit from One Acre Fund. We procure that seed and fertilizer in bulk, and we distribute it to a network of village-level market points in the areas where we work. So that makes it incredibly easy for the farmer. They only have to walk maybe 2 miles maximum to pick up that seed and fertilizer in time for planting. Very, very easy, and also inexpensive. And farmers are receiving that seed and fertilizer on credit. We do consider ourselves to be somewhat of a financing organization, but we do not offer cash loans. We only lend seed and fertilizer. We think this is a way for us to limit our risk as an organization, but it's also a way for the farmer to guarantee their success. If they have access to high quality inputs, we know they can put them to good use. And that's because of the third part of our operating model, which is training and education. We have a network of over 1,000 full-time salaried local field staff who work at the village level to function essentially as both loan officers and agriculture extension workers. So they collect loan repayment in cash from farmers over the course of the agriculture season, but they also disseminate training and education to farmers in the fields where they work. So a typical training week for a field officer at planting time might look something like 6 meetings in the morning, Monday through Saturday, to about 40 to 50 farmers in each meeting, and then afternoons spent visiting individual farmers in their fields to check up and see if that planting technique is being implemented correctly. So it's extremely high touch, extremely hands-on. The fourth part of the operating model is market facilitation. So part of that training is extensive training on post-harvest handling and storage. Once you have a big surplus for the first time, what do you do with it? It's a good problem to have, but also a problem because many farmers have never contended with it before. So One Acre Fund provides very basic storage tools for farmers to store at the household level safely so that they can actually store that surplus for up to a year until their next harvest, and they have complete flexibility as to when they enter the market with that surplus. They don't feel compelled to sell at harvest because they're worried about crop rotting or pest infestation of their crop. They can wait until the price is high. The second innovation that we offer is distribution. So I talked a little bit about how we bring that seed and fertilizer within 2 miles of the farmer. This is one district of operations in Rwanda. It's Namasheke district in the southwestern corner of the country next to Lake Kivu. And the yellow star shows the only place that you could get seed and fertilizer before One Acre Fund started working in that district. So basically, if you were a farmer living, well, pretty much anywhere except right next to that yellow star, seed and fertilizer might as well not exist there because there was no way you could reach that place. Rwanda is extremely hilly, and things need to be close for them to be accessible to farmers, particularly fertilizer, which is quite heavy. These red pinpoints show all of the places where farmers can now access seed and fertilizer in that district. These red pinpoints represent One Acre Fund field staff. They're actually not, and I want to stress this, physical shops. These are places at the village level where our field officers work, and when it's time for seed and fertilizer distribution, they schedule essentially a series of meetings with farmers where they say, okay, these 4 groups on Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock come to this location location and pick up your seed and fertilizer. We don't think it's practical to be running stores, actually, nor do we want to compete with agro dealers as they develop in the community. So this is the system that we've developed. And those drops often happen in places like schoolyards or maybe right next to the chief's office, central places in the community. So the combination of these two things, the bundled service model with very deep rural distribution, is what has allowed One Acre Fund to scale quite rapidly in East Africa. And I just kind of wanted to show you this, this slide of our field operating unit, which I described as that one field officer working directly with farmers, offering that service bundle to about 250 farmers at the village level with 1,000 children in those families. So you can see that this is a model that's quite easy to replicate. Each district of operations that we have has anywhere between 30 and 50 field officers. They're managed by a group of field managers, and the whole district is managed by a field director. So this is an operating structure that doesn't look that different from a company like a Starbucks or a McDonald's. It's a very, very easy to replicate operating unit, and we really have borrowed that from the private sector. So as I promised, I wanted to tell you a little bit about two specific parts of that service bundle that really get at what One Acre Fund is trying to do in terms of climate change adaptation for our clients. The first is trees. So as I mentioned, we primarily work with staple food crops. However, over time, we've been supplementing that staple food crop loan package to add in some things that are much better for farmers in the long term. Land stewardship. So all of our clients in Kenya and Rwanda now have access to tree seeds. We use local varieties that require relatively low amounts of water and are also nitrogen fixing. So these have some long-term benefits for soil structure. And we, of course, never just give people seeds. We actually pair those seeds with education and training on how to create seed beds, how to transplant your seedlings correctly to avoid heavy loss of seedlings at that point in the process. And our farmers have really benefited from that detailed education because most of them have never grown trees from seed before. Our results with this program have been pretty successful. In 2011, our farmers in Kenya alone planted over 400,000 trees. In 2012, we expanded this to Rwanda, and between Kenya and Rwanda, our clients planted over 4 million trees. So we're pretty excited about, oh, sorry. No, that is in 1 year. So the 2011 is only in 2011. 2012 is only 2012. It does not encompass the figure from 2011. And the 2012, though, is Kenya and? Rwanda. Yeah, exactly. So one part of One Acre Fund's operating model really focuses on sustainable intensification. How can we increase production on existing land so that farmers don't have to move onto additional land that would probably entail cutting down trees? Another part of our program is really focused on reforestation. So how can we take land that farmers are already using for agriculture and introduce more forest cover to that land while still allowing farmers to increase their staple food crop yields? I can't not mention that trees do have an economic benefit, and I want to be clear that our clients are not only interested in trees for the environmental benefits, and I think this kind of gets at one of the key issues on how do you sell a product that we would perceive as primarily being an environmental thing, something that really is going to help with long-term climate change issues. Whereas for a farmer, they're just, at the end of the day, their primary concern is how can we make enough money for our families? And trees do have a lot of economic benefits, and our clients have gotten tremendously excited about trees because of these benefits. I've met farmers who tell me, that's my plot of trees, and that's my secondary school fund for my oldest daughter. In 6 years, when those trees are really large, I'm going to sell all of them, and then I'll have enough to pay secondary school fees for 4 years. So you can see farmers don't actually have a lot of financial mechanisms in the rural areas, and they have caught on to the fact that trees can be a really lucrative long-term savings program. This is not to say that everyone is growing trees just to cut them down and sell them. I think that people now realize that it's great to have trees at all stages of growth. So the farmers who received tree seeds last year and now have trees that are 1 year old are planting tree seeds again. They see this as a sustainable source of income and also something that's improving the soil on their land. The second product that I wanted to talk about is crop insurance. And I was really struck in the video that Kevin showed. It starts off with a woman saying, nowadays the long rains are like the short rains. And that woman was a farmer from Tanzania. And I think that you could ask a number of 1 acre fund farmers in Kenya if that holds true for them, and they would absolutely agree. There may not have been a decrease in overall rainfall level across the year, but there is extreme changes in when that rain's coming, what volume of rain is coming within a specific period of days. And that's making farming really unpredictable and therefore more risky. Even though these are farmers who are in areas that experience a great deal of rain throughout the year, they're very nervous about when that rain will come and will it be the right quantity at the right time. And crop insurance is a really important way to mitigate that risk. Pretty much every farmer in the United States has crop insurance that is subsidized by the US government. Same thing is not true for farmers in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, well, only commodity farmers in the US, you know. So
Yeah.
if you're growing corn or wheat, that's true, but not for if you're growing vegetables, for instance.
Right. So anyway, like if you were a maize farmer in Kenya, for instance, the Kenyan government would not be subsidizing your crop insurance. That would be nice if they did. All of our clients in Kenya and now some of our clients in Rwanda have access to crop insurance, and it's bundled in with their loan. So you receive your seed and fertilizer on credit, and you receive crop insurance as part of that loan product. The price of the premium is 10%, and the reason that it's able to be relatively low is because it's a weather-indexed insurance product. I think this is a pretty innovative product, actually, because it seriously decreases the transaction cost of crop insurance for a small farmer. And this is a product that was developed by the Syngenta Foundation in Kenya, and they call it Kilimo Salama, which means safe farming in Swahili. And it works through a really great network of solar-powered weather stations. That's a picture of one of the weather stations. They're located at the district and now sub-district level, and they measure the amount of rainfall on a daily basis. If rainfall levels are either too high or too low during one of 3 periods during the growing season, that triggers an automatic payout. So last year in Kenya, in one of our districts, the weather station showed that there had been not enough rain in the initial planting period, the first tranche of the season, and it triggered a payout. Actually, our farmers in that district were just fine. Their field officers had been telling them, just wait, don't plant until there have been 3 solid days of rain. And all of those farmers waited, and so their germination rates were just fine. And so as an organization, we chose to take that payout and put it in a bank account for a day when the insurance product doesn't trigger and there is an extreme weather event. I don't want to be a sort of 100% evangelist for a weather indexed insurance product. It absolutely does have flaws. It's going to trigger sometimes when you don't need it to. There are other times when it won't trigger and you wish that it had. And so we're trying to figure that out because it's still a new product, but I think it does have a lot of benefits for farmers. We've now expanded that product, as I mentioned, to Rwanda starting last year with some of our farmers in the southern part of the country. So what does this mean, the bundled service model, the deep rural distribution, what does this mean for an individual farmer and how does it affect their life? I wanted to share with you just one story of a 1 acre fund farmer. Her name is Carolyn Lunani. She is there with her youngest child, Rock. She is 28 years old. She lives in Western Kenya in a district called Chwele. And she joined 1 Acre Fund in 2009. And every year since 2009, she has grown maize on progressively larger pieces of land. So she started out with 1/2 acre of maize seed and fertilizer on credit, and she got a really great harvest. Prior to that year, she told me she had never grown more than 1 bag of maize on an entire acre of land. Pretty shocking. Well, she had never had access to fertilizer before. So her best harvest ever was actually her 2012 harvest. This is a picture of Carolyn in the middle of the season weeding her fields. You can see that her maize is planted in very nice rows, and she's doing a good job weeding. And as a result, she was able to harvest over 80 bags of maize on 3 acres of land. Why did Carolyn feel comfortable increasing her planting area to 3 acres? Because of crop insurance. She never would have felt comfortable taking on the risk of a loan for 3 acres of seed and fertilizer if not for the fact that she had that crop insurance. She knew that if the rains were to fail, she would be protected. She would not be responsible for repaying that loan. The insurance would cover it, and she would be able to enter the new season not at a deficit. And that ability to mitigate risk is so key for farmers like Carolyn. So what did she do with her money? Many things, actually. She bought a big cow, very nice. All Kenyans love cows, so this is probably, you know, the #1 thing that people want to buy when they have additional money. But I personally think that this is a better investment, rental housing. Carolyn is a very savvy businesswoman, and she built these rental houses. Sorry, there's a little typo there. It is $4 US a month per house, so she's making $16 US a month from that rental housing. And she actually told me she wants to build more because she thinks there's enough demand. I really like this because it's a non-agriculture source of income. So though she is still a farmer, she's diversifying her income and mitigating her risk even further. Really important thing to do. That is a great question. I don't know who's renting. There is a pretty large secondary school nearby, so it may be that she's renting to teachers. This is certainly not a viable business everywhere, but in her particular location it is. But she still had more money to invest, actually, in addition to enough food for her family, so she decided to spend it on school fees for her oldest children. This is Queen. She's now in her 2nd year of secondary school, so she's about a sophomore in high school. And Reagan is in his last year of secondary school and has plans to attend a technical training institute next year. And Carolyn hasn't forgotten about her son Renton, who is now in nursery school. I love to see children going into nursery school because it's something that actually has a tuition cost associated with it. If you are poor and don't have money for school fees, you don't put your kids in school until primary, because in Kenya, primary school is free. So this is a really great sign of the family's increased prosperity. And this is the whole family together. I just want to say that I'm not telling Carolyn's story because she's an extraordinary client of One Acre Fund. We have over 100,000 farmers that are just like her, that once they have access to seed, fertilizer, financing, and some training and education, they're able to make these significant changes in their lives. I think that's why it's so important for us to see that there are a lot of opportunities with small farmers. It's not all negative. And just quickly, I'll just show you kind of our plans for growth as an organization. As I said, 160,000 farmers by the end of this year, doubling farm profit per acre, and we will receive $19 million US in farmer loan revenue from our clients. This will cover 75% of our field operating costs, so 75% financial sustainability. Our goal, of course, is 100%, and we should reach that in the next 3 years in Kenya and Rwanda. What is our 2020 vision? To have the largest network of smallholder farmers in Africa. To partner directly with African governments, which is something we're already starting to do in Kenya and Rwanda. And to help microfinance institutions see that smallholder farmers are a viable market for them. There are approximately 32 million smallholder farmers, just like the ones that I've talked about today, and many of them are food insecure. They will all have to contend with the ongoing effects of climate change. I think that anyone working in agriculture development has an obligation to think about how can we work at scale with this population of people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. It was great to hear about the innovative practices that the One Acre Fund is employing in East Africa. Thank you for sharing that and for sharing the particular stories of a few individuals who are benefiting from your programs. I think it was really great to bring these issues to life through those personal stories. I'm looking forward to our discussion period and would love to hear maybe a little bit more about some of the challenges and opportunities in bringing this model to scale. As well as, if we have time, I would love to hear a little bit about your ideas on how we can tweak the crop insurance model to be even more effective than it currently is. So we will look forward to having that discussion shortly. And without further ado, we will move on to our final panelist, Susan Bradley. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having us, and thank you for coming on this rainy day. I see a lot of familiar faces, and then I see some less familiar. So I was asked to give an overview, and I will, but it's going to be very brief, a very brief overview of the President's Feed the Future initiative. This initiative started as a $3.5 billion initiative. It was born out of the high food price crisis beginning in 2007, and it's inspired by the Green Revolution. It built on the experiences gained through IEA and the global food security response. It adopted a framework that was and still is used by the Office of Food for Peace. It's a framework of food security, which is, the definition is availability, access, utilization, and increasingly we're bringing stability into that definition. The initiative was announced in 2009 at the G8 summit in L'Aquila, and maybe some of you have heard of AFSI, which was really a global food security initiative, and it's the L'Aquila Food Security Initiative. It was a 3-year initiative, but there is agreement to continue the mutual accountability piece of that. So donors will be tracking their own and other food security investments. And this is probably to help prevent what we saw occur in the 80s and 90s, which was sort of, and I should say 90s and 2000s, where we moved away from investment in agriculture and agriculture research and development. So we want to make sure that we don't make the same mistake again. We'll be tracking. It is part of a global G20 and plus effort. The principles of the L'Aquila Food Security Initiative have been signed on by all UN participant countries. So it's a large initiative. In the US, the Feed the Future initiative, which is our contribution to this broader global food security initiative, is a whole of government initiative. So it draws in MCC resources, USDA resources, State Department. We work with Peace Corps, we work with Commerce, we work with a wide variety, increasingly with NIH and CDC. So the initiative as it stands now has 19 what we call priority countries, but all countries that are receiving USAID agriculture resources are actually being aligned underneath a common framework. This slide basically lets you see a little bit about what our priorities are in 2013. You'll notice G's and R's sort of scattered around, and some really weird, the names aren't matching countries necessarily, but you guys know your geography, you'll figure it out. The G stand for the G8 New Alliance, and those are focused in Africa. And very, very briefly, the New Alliance was a G8 initiative last year, a US government G8 initiative. It is basically to reinvigorate the comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program with increased engagement of private sector. So in a nutshell, that is what this initiative is. It began with a focus on 4 countries. It's up to 6, and hopefully it will continue to grow. Key countries are Tanzania, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia. I think Mozambique is coming online, and Nigeria is coming online this year. So, as I said, I've seen some of you, so I know some of you are following the initiative closely. Here are some of the FY12 results, which I'm not going to go through all of them. I'll just point at a couple because they are a very significant increase over FY11. It just helps let you know, let you see that the initiative is taking hold, that we're beginning to see, at least on an output and outcome level, we're seeing some real results. 7 million farmers have applied new technologies. I love this one. 3.5 million hectares of land came under improved cultivation. And I like it because I've talked to people, including myself, who have no clue as to what a hectare looks like or what that is. But I have been told that 3.5 million hectares actually is about 2 New Jerseys. Not necessarily the best example, but I mean, you wouldn't want to say it is a third of Texas or whatever, but 2 New Jerseys. Over 270 micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises received assistance to access loans, and nearly 250,000 enterprises received business development services. I point at that one because there is a misconception sometimes of the initiative as being, in terms of private sector engagement, looking at big international firms and not really coming down to small enterprise, local private sector, which of course is the key, I think, to food security in many of the countries that we're working in. We have to get local private sector working, and that will in fact improve the environment for increasing investment, whether that be international or regional investments. 12 million children under 5 received nutrition services. This number, of course, includes Food for Peace food assistance programs. They're non-emergency programs, which many of them target your under 5s and under 2 populations. So the initiative has 2 high-level objectives: inclusive ag sector growth and improved nutritional status. So we're making a big bet in the initiative that actually improving agricultural productivity will improve and increase nutritional outcomes. And one of the things we're wrestling with is how to make sure that that actually happens, because it will not happen just because we wish it to. And the evidence is pointing largely to the fact that unless there is deliberate ties between those 2 objectives, then you will not, in fact, have the impacts in nutrition that you desire. So as I was thinking about what we are talking about today, which the impacts of climate change and food security and where they intersect, I thought first, okay, stability, that's it. And then I began thinking about it, and I thought, well, it's stability and it's availability. Then I thought, well, it's access to, and it's a little bit of utilization. So it really brought home to me the fact that climate change and its impacts are completely cross-cutting and will, in fact, impact almost everything that we are trying to do in Feed the Future. So, sustainable food security, and I think that's the key, to me means it has to be climate-smart food security. And in order to achieve climate-smart food security, that means we're going to have to be building resilience and adaptive capacity in agriculture and through agriculture. Probably, I'm going to run through this very quickly. You can read these things. So we're going to be touching on each one as I move along. We'll start with research. This is just a small part of Feed the Future's research agenda, but I wanted to highlight some key aspects that really are trying to help us position ourselves sort of proactively to meet the challenges of climate change. So we're looking at heat and drought tolerant seeds and plant material. We're looking at flood and salinity tolerance, pest and disease resistance, and post-harvest storage and processing. The mantra of our ag and research development team is sustainable intensification, which we've heard a lot about already today. So another key element this idea of managing risk. And I'll talk more about this in a bit, but isn't this a lovely picture? This is what happens when you don't manage risk. This was a picture taken in northern Kenya during the FY 2009 through 2011 drought. Kenya lost about $12.8 billion from its livestock sector. There is no insurance, actually very limited to insurance, I should say. So natural resource management is key in several of the countries where we are working, and it is particularly integrated in our resilience activities, where our ag investments are being combined with humanitarian investments, with water resources and others, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Early warning and information systems. How can you make sure that people actually have access to the kinds of information they need to begin making decisions when faced with a climatic shock? Index-based insurance, which we heard quite a bit about, and other financial tools. Micro savings is actually a really important tool to many vulnerable households. USAID has had more experience in index-based insurance for pastoral populations than it has in crop insurance, but is a very promising tool, and it's expanding. Land and resource tenure. I can't begin to tell you how important this particular issue is to what we're dealing with today, and we've heard it mentioned again and again. What isn't there is something we also have heard today, is migration and migration rights. So if we're thinking sort of the key legal issues that we're going to have to understand and deal with as climate change expands, it's land and resource tenure, particularly access to water, use of water, and then migration and rights to migration, labor migration. It's going to become increasingly important. Conflict management, certainly in the areas in the Sahel and in the Horn, conflict management is intimately tied with people's ability to exercise the coping mechanisms that are effective. If they can't move, their animals will die. And often managing conflict is the most cost-effective way to protect their animals. Formal and informal safety nets. Actually, we heard a good example out of your Tanzania, your Tanzania example, where, yeah, if you're at the bottom and you're dependent on wealthier households, that is your security. And so you will work, you will do whatever you can having to do in exchange for those goods. But part of the key, the vulnerability that we've seen in the Horn and increasingly in the Sahel is the erosion of informal safety nets. Sustainable intensification. So improving soil quality, using fertilizers efficiently and effectively, minimizing the use of pesticides and herbicides, employing environmental management systems, ensuring safe post-harvest storage and processing, and maintaining habitats. I want to just zero in on two of these. One is the employing environmental management systems. We have learned so much from the humanitarian side of the house, particularly conservation agriculture, which was being used and being actually being widely used in OFDA before we picked it up. We've expanded, but it's based on the lessons of our the humanitarian side of the house. Ensuring safe post-harvest storage and processing. This is probably less relevant to what we're talking about here, but it is increasingly recognized as an important aspect of our own efforts at sustainable intensification. And that is because by preserving what's usually lost, you're reducing what you have to plant. And by preserving what's usually lost and preserving it safely, you are actually going to be contributing to the nutritional kind of outcomes that you're aiming for, both in your ag programs and your nutrition programs. So, empowering women, we've touched on that again and again. One of the things that evidence has shown is that women, when they control resources, obviously have the ability and actually do impact nutritional outcomes in a positive way. But it's also education. It is almost every social outcome in a household has greater positive impact when a woman is empowered to be controlling resources and influencing decisions within that household. So we consider empowering women to be sort of at the heart of adapting to and basically facilitating household adaptation to climate change. But in order to really do this, there are huge numbers of contextual pieces that you really have to be able to understand, and that's why some of the research that's being done by CARE and others is so helpful to us. The time constraints, the mobility constraints, literacy, access and control of resources, as I said, and there again, land and resource tenure, which is already an issue, but it's multiplied for women who have much more, their rights to land and resources tend to be significantly constrained. Promoting equality in women's leadership, big words. The way we are approaching it in Feed the Future is that it really means that you have to tap into women's voices, and that means they have to be brought into, or you have to ensure that they're brought into activities, and then provided the opportunity to take leadership, provided the opportunity to speak. You'll see, or what we are seeing, is that the impacts of programs that have had women decision makers actually are moving forward. The programs themselves are much more successful and are moving forward more predictably. In fact, I remember I was up in northern Kenya a few months ago, and we were talking to an association of pastoralists, and they were very proud of the fact that they had a woman treasurer, because they said, we can trust her. And we sort of said, okay. And they said, oh, yes, the past 2 treasurers, they ran away with the money. That's why we have a woman treasurer now. I thought, okay, what more can I say? So using women's skills and knowledge, we've heard that the importance of looking at sort of what's happening, sort of the indigenous knowledge, and particularly what women know about adapting and what they've been through in their own households and how they have adapted, whether that's childbirth, loss of a husband, whether it's the loss of the cow. How did they manage, and how did the household manage? Equal access to information. This one is so important because men oftentimes have access that women don't. If they are sitting someplace where there is a radio and they're listening to radio, that doesn't necessarily mean that their wives will ever hear what was on that radio. I think this is one of those areas where efforts to increase ICT, the sort of technology, is really going to be helping us. So I'll very briefly, policy reform and implementation. This always gets short shrift, but it is so important. Here again, land tenure and rights. I forgot to mention communal land tenure. We've got Chris Kosnick back there who could talk about it forever and ever. As they're trying to get some communal land tenure legislation through in Kenya. Certainly where there are pastoral populations, this is a very critical issue, along with water use and access rights. Labor migration, again, pastoral mobility, regional and cross-border trade and migration. One of the things I think we saw in the CARE presentation was the idea that people weren't just migrating in Tanzania, they were migrating into Kenya, or if you're in the Sahel, you're migrating down into Cote d'Ivoire. So it's a cross-border as well as an internal issue. technology development and development transfer, which we heard 1 acre, one of the main points is that people to have access to high quality inputs. How does that happen? It's a very interesting model. I hope we get to talk a little more about the 1 acre model. Monitor and evaluate for real-time learning. I'm not going to read all of these words. There are many of them. Actually, I pulled out these the top 3 questions from the FGF learning agenda, and they were the only questions in there that I saw that were perhaps relevant for this issue. And I point that out in that I think there's more work that we have to do in Feed the Future to wrestle with some of these questions to make sure they're being evaluated and built in. The evaluations are built into our programs. Okay, so in Feed the Future, where are these various pieces coming together? I've put a couple of examples here. Bangladesh, we're working with urea deep placement, and it cuts down on the amount of fertilizer that has to be used. It greatly increases productivity with less harm to the environment. 5 minutes, oh goodness. Zambia, there again, building on OFDA, conservation agriculture. I'm going to skip the rest of these because I want to jump right into probably what's most relevant for us, which is the resilience efforts in the Horn and the Sahel. Very quickly, I put this model up because it really does emphasize that you have to pay attention to adaptation that is already occurring. And in the Horn, we have a perfect example where adaptation is occurring. Pastoralists are leaving pastoralism. They're migrating to urban centers primarily, or they are moving into livelihoods that support pastoralism themselves. Pastoralism is beginning to commercialize, which means smaller numbers of herders with larger number of animals. And this can either work to the good or work to the bad, but it's understanding how that adaptation is occurring and then trying to prepare people in a way that actually benefits the greatest number, whether they're leaving pastoralism or staying in pastoralism. In Ethiopia, that comes down to anticipating that a growing number are going to be falling out and migrating, and beginning to think of, well, what kind of education can we make sure that they leave with? What kind of training? What's going to best equip them for a life outside of pastoralism? A little bit different in the Sahel, which is where we are also working with resilience, in that some of the greatest vulnerability isn't in the pastoral communities, it's in the agro-pastoral communities. But in the Sahel, there is a lot to build on that has changed. Farmer management of natural resources, there's been a huge reclamation of land that is now actually, well, you've heard the regreening of the Sahel. So we're building on sort of learning that has shown us that when people do have rights to their own assets, their own land, in the Sahel, the issue with trees was that people didn't own them. They didn't have the right to cut down that tree. And once legislation was put into place which enabled, and this was in Niger and in Mali too, provided ownership of trees to the households themselves, all of a sudden the value of that tree shot up. And people have been regreening, reforesting on their own without the help of any kind of project now, because the value to them is apparent. I'm not going to go into gender because we have talked about it. We have all sort of acknowledged that the key to understanding and promoting gender equality is to understand the context, understand the limitations, and then look for leverage points. Not going to go there. Okay, what next? Within USAID, we are promoting the better integration of assistance resources, something we heard about earlier. So agriculture, water, our global health resources, our humanitarian resources. We are trying to bring them together in integrated programming and layered programming. We are trying to support and learn effective adaptive capacities, as I've said, both in the Horn and the Sahel, and we're going to be learning from those to be able to apply them elsewhere. We are trying to accelerate technology transfer, and this is a significant priority of the administrator. But I'm going to move very quickly because I want to get to this last thing. Globally, expanding research and surveillance partnerships. Access to data is a very exciting right now, it's a very exciting sort of time to be thinking about it. Open data, data sharing, also tapping into some incredible existing institutions and making sure that NASA, for example, our data coming out of our own weather surveillance is being used in Kenya or is being used in Malawi. Strengthening regional and national risk management capacities. It can't all be the international community. The capacities have to be in country, have to be in regions, and increasingly owned at a national level and a regional level. That is where sort of the accountability then to response is going to happen. When you own the early warning and you're owning the analysis of that data, you own the response. Finally, anticipating migration. And this is the difference between desirable migration, which is maybe what we're seeing with positive labor migration in the Sahel, and positive migration that could be occurring to some extent. Some of the migration that occurs in Bangladesh, in Nepal, is very positive. Remittances are sent back, they're invested into communities, and that's a positive thing. How do we actually promote and foster that as opposed to sort of waiting for the displacement migration? And I would argue that we're seeing displacement migration, again, both in the Sahel and the Horn, when we see fallouts, people who have lost everything, and they migrate to an urban center with nothing, and not the skills to survive nor the resources to survive. So one of the things, and I mentioned it before, I do think that as a community we have to really begin to think about is the right to migration, what that's going to look like, that discussion is going to look like, and then also the role of education, how to really prepare for the fact that change is occurring and could occur much more rapidly than we anticipate. So that's it, I think.
Great. Thank you very much, Susan. I think that was a great way to cap off our presentations, to learn a little bit more about the Feed the Future initiative and the ways in which climate change adaptation is being brought in. Before we open it up for question and answer and discussion with all of you, I just wanted to flag a couple of points that I found very interesting and that I hope will help to frame our discussion as well. I do think the final point that you had there, Susan, about anticipating migration and thinking about, I think often we feel that migration ends up being, we see it as a failure of adaptation, when increasingly I think the kinds of information that we're seeing coming from this care research is that we can begin to think of migration as an adaptive response, and how can we create enabling environments that will create a situation in which it would really contribute to resilience and greater development outcomes for communities that are at risk, particularly in the context of climate change and population growth. I noted that a number of the geographic areas that we've discussed today, starting off with Senegal, as I mentioned, but also Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, these are countries that are already fairly densely populated and experiencing pretty rapid population growth rates, with projected doubling of population within the next 35 to 40 years in a number of these places. And when we're faced with very real physical constraints in terms of land resources and water resources, certainly the migration issue will only grow, I think, when we're looking at those kinds of demographic changes, resource constraints, and climate changes. So I'd like to just kind of leave that as some closing remarks from the panel and open it up to all of you for questions and answers. And I think what we would like to do is to take a couple of questions, maybe 3 or 4 questions. And as Sandeep mentioned at the beginning, since this program is being webcast as well as recorded, please do speak clearly into the microphone as it comes around to you and identify yourself and your affiliation before you ask your question, please. Thanks. We've got one here and one here.
Hi, my name is Elise Solorio. I'm with ACDI VOCA. Thanks all of you for your presentations. My question is for Stephanie. It's actually 2 parts. The first is, where does One Acre Fund source the inputs that they distribute? And the second is, you kind of touched on maybe the lack of existing agro-dealers. To what extent are there opportunities to work with whatever agro-dealers do exist in the areas you work in? And how is One Acre Fund sort of pursuing those opportunities or looking into maybe building capacity or creating a more enabling environment for existing agro-dealers to provide the inputs that you're distributing?
Hugh Haskell from the Institute of Energy and Environmental Research. One of the things I did not hear talked about today was how easy it is to implement these things. It seems to me that there's going to be pushback. A lot of people see these enabling efforts as a zero-sum game, and so the idea is that educating, empowering, liberating women is going to have a converse effect on the men, which I think is probably not true, but is widely believed. And I wonder if what you have run into on that and what might be done to mitigate these problems.
We'll take one back there and one here.
Thank you for the presentations. My name is Ambassador Jean Kamau from the Kenya Mission. Just a question to Stephanie, how do your field workers work with the government officials also working on food security issues? Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Medea Nawaz. I'm with ACDI VOCA. My question is also for Stephanie. Stephanie, I'm really interested in your model, but one thing that I'm interested in how you work with female-headed households and the issues with land accessibility and land inheritance, and have you come across those challenges and how you've dealt with them?
Okay, why don't we take that as our first round for very interesting questions, and with a focus on Stephanie. I think for this first round, would you like to start us off, Stephanie?
Sure. I guess I'm not going to be fully comprehensive in my response to any of these, so if you want more information, maybe talk to me afterwards, but I'll try to address all of the questions. The first was, how does One Acre Fund source inputs, and do we work with agro-dealers? So it's a little bit different for seed and fertilizer, and it's a little bit different in each country where we operate. For seed, we source all of our seed locally. This is pretty much what everyone needs to do. In Kenya, we work with all of the major seed suppliers, Kenya Seed, Western Seed. We also work with Panner. In Rwanda, there isn't much of a private sector seed industry, but we do end up sourcing a fair amount of seed actually from the Government Research Institute there. In terms of fertilizer, we import fertilizer. Fertilizer is only produced in one country in sub-Saharan Africa, that's South Africa. So we actually import our fertilizer in Kenya. It comes from a number of different producers. And in Rwanda, well, actually the situation is currently changing there significantly. So for every season up until the present, we have sourced fertilizer directly from the Rwandan government. They have been the sole importer of fertilizer in that country. And in an exciting new development, they are privatizing the sector, and we are now one of 3 authorized fertilizer distributors in Rwanda. We will be distributing to 1/3 of the country starting in September. So that's a new development there. In terms of agro-dealer partnerships, I think this is a really interesting question. To be honest, the main reason that we don't work with agro-dealers is because we are a lending organization and we need to mitigate our risk. We really cannot guarantee that we could deliver seed and fertilizer on time to our clients if we were partnering with agro-dealers. There are not enough of them out there. They don't have reliable supply. There are many, many problems. And we actually see agro-dealers as another actor in the market serving smallholder farmers, but probably not serving the exact same market that we are. We're targeting the farmers that are furthest from paved roads with the lowest amount of capital. I think agro-dealers are really appropriate for the farmer who's the next level up. What are we doing to facilitate growth of the market for agro-dealers? Well, we're creating a lot of people who are really happy with improved seed and fertilizer. So that should be a ready market for agro-dealers in any of the countries where we operate. I'm going to skip the women empowerment question and leave that for my colleagues here on the panel. How do One Acre Fund field officers work with the Kenyan government? Thank you for that question, because that is a particular passion of mine at One Acre Fund. We have a team of 5 people in Kenya that work on government relations. 4 of them are based out in Western Kenya, in Western and Nyanza provinces. And their job is to know everyone in the local government who works on agriculture. So that could be the provincial director of agriculture, the district agriculture officers, all the way down to the frontline extension workers. Everyone in the geographies where we're working knows us, knows our work, and in many cases doesn't just know our government relations people, but also knows our field staff. We think it's really, really important for our work to be aligned with the Kenya government's agriculture development strategy. It is a sound strategy. We agree with it 100%. And we always make sure that we are in collaboration with the Ministry of Agriculture's staff at the local level. I would say the most recent concrete example of this is there's a relatively new maize disease in Kenya. It's called MLND, and we've been collaborating very closely with those district agriculture officers to educate not just One Acre Fund farmers, but all farmers in Western Kenya about that disease and how to detect it in your fields. The last question was about female-headed households, land tenure. Okay, that's a really complicated question, and I think in the interest of time, we can maybe discuss that one after the panel, but I want to give Susan and Kevin an opportunity to respond to questions as well.
Great. You want to do zero-sum game, or you?
Well, I'll just make a couple comments on that point, and there are other of my care colleagues who are actually even more knowledgeable on this than I am. But I'll just say, when you're focusing on women's empowerment, you're not going to empower women if you're not also working with men and boys, and so that's always a critical part of what care does, and I think it just makes common sense. You don't want the men to feel entirely, excluded from the process. And after all, in many cases, it's their behaviors that need to change. I think also, there's lots of evidence that when women are able to contribute more to the household and bring more income, it often enhances their status within the household. Now, it can lead to conflict. It can even lead to violence in some cases. So how that's managed is obviously very critical. But I think it was Susan, who mentioned that when women actually generate and control more of the income, there's plenty of evidence that goes in more productive ways from a household perspective and actually produces long-term gain. So, I think maybe I'll stop there, and others can add to that.
Yeah, no, just to take it, if the men in the community, men in the household, aren't perceiving the value, then the chances of it being sustainable are not so good. But very often, after time, that the value of greater control, greater involvement in terms of decision-making and resource creation, it is perceived as a value. And that's a step that you can work with to get to the next step. So,
I think that raises a really important point that that climate change adaptation initiatives can, in some ways, perhaps offer opportunities for increasing gender equity. We often hear about increased vulnerability of women when we're thinking about the gendered impacts of climate change, and I think the example that you gave earlier, Kevin, in Bangladesh, where when we see the men migrating out of the community, often the women who are left behind are at greater risk for sexual harassment, for example. But I think it's also really useful and interesting and probably pretty productive to think about the ways in which our adaptation strategies can actually contribute to tap into women's capabilities and contribute to greater empowerment in and of themselves, and I'm glad to hear some examples related to that. Before we turn it over to the next round of questions, I wondered if anyone wanted to take a little bit of a stab at the women's land access and inheritance questions. I know, Stephanie, you recognize that it is a very complicated, complex question to tackle, but I'm not sure if Feed the Future has some perspectives on the inheritance question that would be interesting to add to this discussion.
Well, I'll say that inheritance is just one piece of what is a very, very complicated issue. Sometimes there is good policy on the books, good equitable policy on the books. It is simply not implemented, either because it's running into traditional mores that say no, women can't own, or there simply isn't the will to implement the policy. Literacy ties right into the question, can a woman sign her name? Is a woman's name on the land title? So inheritance is one, I think it's just one piece of the puzzle. Feed the Future, along with other G8 partners, are working very closely through the New Alliance and through Feed the Future more broadly, and the food security efforts more broadly, to tackle land tenure, equitable land tenure, as part of basically a policy reform initiative. So that's built into what we're doing, but it is a very, very complicated issue that you can't come head on. It doesn't come head on. You don't simply say, this is a question of gender equity, you will change your policies. You've really got to come at it from different angles. So,
yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is the women's ownership, inheritance rights is just one piece of that larger piece of access and control over natural resources by poor people. And, you know, so it's a much bigger thing. And of course, if you look just in sub-Saharan Africa, you have so many different systems, you know, of traditional ownership, you know, what we think of as kind of, you know, land ownership and title as we have here in this country is non-existent. In some countries, it's just emerging. In others, you know, you have communal property rights, you have, you know, customary property rights. So there are many ways of approaching it, but I'll just say that at the end of the day, and Susan's example is very good, you know, in a place like Niger, where it used to be that farmers didn't own the trees that were planted on their own land, you know, and now they do, and that completely changes their behaviors. And so I think, you know, there is something kind of essential in human nature that kind of leads people to pay more attention to something that they own and control and that will benefit their children or grandchildren or whatever. So I think it's a very important issue, and women, equitable rights for women, equal rights for women in that regard is then the next layer of that.
Thank you. Okay, let's go with Brian, Tanya, here and here.
Hi, everyone. Brian Greenberg with Interaction. Wanted first to thank all the panelists and Kathleen and Woodrow Wilson Center for bringing attention to this really important set of issues. And I hope to hear more on these issues going forward. I have one point which I think would best be addressed to Stephanie, and then another perhaps for any of you that might care to respond. For Stephanie, basically, I'm curious about fertilizer management in unirrigated settings. One of the long-standing constraints to the expansion of Green Revolution kinds of models had been that fertilizer use is easiest, most productive when it maps onto irrigation, essentially, and that it's technically challenging and a management burden often in rain-fed areas. So how have you guys gotten beyond that, and has that additional risk been at all a problem for the reinsurance market around that? And your sort of insurers willing to, obviously they are willing to embrace that, but if you could tell us just a little bit about why. And then for everyone else, I really started thinking about Susan's phrase on desirable migration, because I think it points us towards a lot of really important issues around migration. It may be the case that for many people experiencing it at the time, the choice to migrate and that sort of split household approach seems like maybe not desirable, but the best of a set of somewhat problematic options. And it's good to have that in a household. But it raises questions, especially for the female-headed households left behind, often under it's a very challenging assignment to pick up a marginal plot with rain-fed agriculture, small land holding, market signals may not be in your favor, infrastructure may not be in your favor. It's a tough assignment to leave women with that kind of a livelihood option, and it's great that there are supports and some pathways out. But how do we avoid the risk of potentially keeping them in what has often been viewed at the very bottom end, marginal smallholders, as a non-viable economic strategy? How do we keep them out of what has been viewed as poverty traps right at the bottom of smallholder production? So.
Hi, Tanya Raw with CARE. Susan, I first wanted to thank you for your reference to the work that Feed the Future is doing to help food insecure households really manage risk, particularly your reference to information systems. I hope that we see some of that talked about in the next progress report that's coming out later this year. I also really appreciate your reference to needing to expand the learning agenda for Feed the Future, and hope that one of the things that can look at is effective interventions to prepare food insecure households to adapt. My question then is, recognizing that implementing programs in a really comprehensive way and integrating gender and natural resource management and climate change and nutrition, recognizing that that's not always easy, I'm wondering if you can talk from USAID's perspective about the greatest challenges to doing that. Thank you.
Hi, Julia Kent from the World Wildlife Fund. I guess this question's mostly for Kevin, but sort of coming off some of these definitions of the types of migration that, Susan, you referenced. And I was really curious, Kevin, you mentioned that you were finding the majority of the households were migrating rural to rural, not rural to urban, and whether that's because of the type of migration, whether that's migration to areas with better growing conditions versus households that are migrating to seek a different type of livelihood beyond farming. So just wondering if you could expand a little bit more about the types of migration that you're seeing.
And last one in this round, over here.
Hi, my name is Patricia Biermeyer, and I am at Georgetown University. My question is actually piggybacking on your question, and for Kevin. Your study has looked into 8 countries. So the idea is to look into the cropping systems that these people carry and move. When they move, they have an indigenous knowledge and they replicate that. Have you looked into the patterns of cropping system in order to look into management risk? What do they use, for example, livestock and cash crops, food crops, the combination of issues? Have you looked into those and the way they have been replicated? And actually for Stephanie, I will be really very interested in looking into the land tenure issue and whether the reforestation program has something to do with it. I mean, how have you looked into reforestation and land tenure? As women normally do not have the tenure of the land. And to plant trees, you normally ensure that you're gonna harvest the benefits. So that's a question.
Thank you. So another good set of questions here. Who would like to start?
Well, maybe I can start. There were a couple questions more specific to the migration. But before I do that, I did want to comment on the issue of whether it's a narrow question of use of fertilizer in rain-fed agriculture, but I would just broaden that to the discussion of agricultural inputs more broadly. And what do we actually mean when we talk about sustainable intensification, and how much inputs of what sorts actually do we want to be promoting, whether from an environmental perspective or from a financial viability perspective for smallholder farmers in rain-fed agriculture. I think it's a huge issue, and I won't even go into, I mean, absolutely, if we think that for smallholder agriculture to be viable and to help lift people out of poverty and not just be that permanent poverty trap, we have to significantly increase the productivity of smallholder agriculture. So how do you do that? Certainly better inputs are absolutely a part of that. Better seed material is definitely a part of that, but does that need to include GMOs? You've got all of those issues. On fertilizers, how much chemical fertilizer do you want to use? What's the scope for use of organic inputs? We have to remember that globally, agriculture is not just a victim of climate change, it's also a major contributor to greenhouse gases. And of course, a lot of that is in industrial countries with highly industrialized approaches to agriculture, but the use of nitrogen fertilizers is one of the biggest sources of those emissions. So I think my approach, and I think, where CARE would position itself is we have to increase productivity. That means more inputs, modern external inputs, but that has to be balanced and limited, frankly. We don't think that the Green Revolution model per se, say as it's playing out in northern India, is actually sustainable intensification. We would argue that's unsustainable intensification, and therefore we need to learn from the lessons of that, while still, still doubling productivity, or even more, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa. You could easily triple productivity of staple crops in Africa, and that's what we need to do. So, but just on migration, a couple things. In response to the question on rural versus rural-urban migration, I wouldn't say that it was in all countries that was the predominant model, but in several it definitely was the predominant model. And I think there are a number of factors that contribute to that. For instance, in the Bangladesh site, very remote site in the north, very low levels of education and skills. These people simply don't have the skills to compete in the urban job market and compete with others who live closer to those areas and who have had higher levels of education. So in many cases, and that was also true in Ghana, where they were mostly migrating to other rural areas that were more productive in that case. So they were going from the far north of Ghana to the middle belt of Ghana, where they could sometimes get 2 crops, a year, or they were going into the mines, whether commercial or artisanal mines, So I think it has a lot to do with the location, with the skills of workers, and the different sort of agro-ecological conditions. We had pastoralists, agro-pastoralists in Kenya who were, moving with their livestock to areas where there were better rains and better pastures, as pastoralists do, the world over. So I think, that would be at least some. I hope that gives you a little bit more sense on that. Now, I wasn't sure that I entirely understood the other question. Certainly, we looked at the cropping systems in the places where we did our research. We weren't able to follow people to where they were going to look at kind of what they were doing there. But my sense from our conversations is they were doing pretty much the same thing where they were going as they were doing where they came from, except their assessment was that conditions were better there. And now, it was very funny, in our Tanzania site, we had this highland site, a midland, we had a lowland. In the lowland, you had a significant Maasai population that had settled, had land and was doing some agriculture, but they were maintaining large, herds of animals. And you just see you don't see a Maasai man, there without a cell phone. And they're talking to their friends and clansmen all over the country, and they know where the rain has been good, where it's been bad, where the pastures are good and not. So, and we saw a very wide range of cropping systems. So I would say mostly some degree of agro-pastoralism. So livestock, whether small or large, are usually a part of the system. I would say in many cases an over-reliance on 1, 2, or 3 crops, not that much diversification, a lot more maize being grown in places in Africa than it should be, for instance, and not enough of crops that are more suited to the actual growing conditions, let alone the changes we anticipate. So I hope that gives you some.
Thank you. I know we have just a couple of minutes left, so I'm not sure that we'll be able to give thorough answers to all of the remaining questions. But what I would ask maybe is for Stephanie to choose one of the questions to respond to, and then we could perhaps cap the event off with Susan helping us to understand the answer to Tanya's question about some of the greatest challenges of doing this kind of integration. I think that would be a really good way to cap off today's discussion. So Stephanie and then Susan, please.
So I'll take the fertilizer management question, always an interesting one. I think it's all about dosing and new planting techniques. We should be looking at new fertilizer blends as well. What can we do to reduce the cost and the environmental impact of fertilizer? And what can we do to make sure that all the fertilizer we're putting into fields is actually used to increase the productivity of crops? I think when we think about fertilizer usage, we most often think about the overusage of fertilizer in developed markets like the United States, and that big dead spot in the ocean now caused by fertilizer runoff from America. Fertilizer usage in sub-Saharan Africa looks very, very different. Farmers are incredibly cost conscious and price sensitive, so they're going to use the minimum amount of fertilizer required to increase their productivity. Microdosing, they love it because it means lower cost for them, lower total amount of fertilizer used, and it is also has side benefits for the environment. So I think everything is about new fertilizer blends, and then really really careful use of planting techniques. And it seems crazy, but these things really have not penetrated sub-Saharan Africa yet. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to do the green revolution in Africa differently.
Okay, close us out, Susan.
Bring us out.
Bring us out.
Well, I could, in fact, talk for many hours about the difficulty within USAID of integrating resources, particularly across development and humanitarian resources, which are not only separated sometimes legislatively, but the culture is so different in large parts of those two sides of the house. But the need to do it is absolutely clear. And in a weird way, I'm going to go back, actually, Kevin, to something I think we heard in the movie, in the clip, which was that you had a woman and her children staying in a place that was very, very hard for her to stay. The challenges there in terms of climate changes were making it almost impossible for her to keep her family alive, and yet she was staying there because schools were there and not someplace else. And that's probably the thing we want to avoid in our thinking, in our planning, in the way we approach how to enable, how to facilitate better adaptation. I do think it is critical that we increase our focus on the role of education, because in order to enable people to move and to change, they have to have the skills to do it. In USAID, I think it's not a connection that has yet been very strongly made. It's one that's often left out of food security, but it's one that we have to focus on. I think we are doing a better job in USAID. I think the resilience agenda and the resilience drumbeat, which I know is easy to be cynical about, but it is actually changing the way missions are being asked to plan. And I think over the long term, it will make for better programming and more rational use of resources. But I think I want to challenge all of us. I mean, it's easy to say USAID has a problem, we stovepipe our resources. Well, you haven't seen stovepipe resources until you begin to deal with the research community versus the humanitarian community. Or, I mean, we all have to do a better job. I love the partnership that we saw here. I think it is the key to the future. Partnerships between research institutions and on-the-ground institutions, development organizations, and groups that can really come back and say to USAID, here is the evidence, so fund it, for goodness sake. You know, it's there. So it's not just an institutional thing.
For goodness sake, fund it.
Yeah, I already have the book.
Oh, you already have the book. Then I'll keep it. Yeah, they're expensive.
Okay, anyway, I know that's not comprehensive, but it's not simply a development organization challenge or a humanitarian. It really is a challenge to all of the partners, as well as the governments that we're working with. So.
Okay, that's a great way for us to finish up. I want to take one moment to once again thank the panelists for sharing these very thought-provoking presentations, and to all of you for a rich and dynamic discussion. Thanks very much.
Somebody left an umbrella in the ladies' room. You probably want to grab that before.
I don't think it was me.
No.
No.